Hey everybody, it's Chris again, and we're part two. We're doing ultra wet watercolor techniques. I always mention that if you haven't seen part one, please go back to part one. Part one, we kind of describe how we got to this point where we have lots of color on our paper. We already had a pencil drawing completed, and now we're just going to start filling in or I should say, kind of painting in more of the details, the line work on this watercolor, ultra wet watercolor. So the technique was really just a recap of what we did. We took this paper, our watercolor paper, Arches rough paper, and we soaked it in a bath of water for maybe 15 minutes before we started. We lifted, we used just a regular pan with about a half an inch of water in it. We put our paper in that pan, let it sit. You could use a bathtub, you could use a cooking pan, something deep, a couple inches or whatever. Depends what size paper you're working with, but you just use the size pan you need to fit your paper into. Let the paper soak, lift the paper out, let the water drain off the paper until it's pretty much all drained off, the water off the paper. And then we just lay it on top of a masonite board here that we have, which we dampened with some water and a sponge before we started. Then we put the paper on top of the damp masonite board, and the paper, basically watercolor paper, just sticks to the board and remains completely flat. And then we already had completed our pencil drawing on that watercolor paper before we wet the paper. So you can do your pencil work first, then you put your paper in the water bath, then you get your paper out of the water bath, put it onto your masonite board. A glass top table would work the same as a masonite board, actually. I've done this on glass top tables. I have an art table that's like a glass top table, so I've worked on glass top tables with this type of technique. That works fine. Pretty much any type of flat table. I keep things neat. And then now we're at the point where we put the color on when the paper was completely drenched and wet. And now that it's dried a little bit, it's starting to kind of lift off the board just a little bit, but we still have some time to work, and this is the perfect time to finish up the line work on this, and then it'll be complete. And then of course the paper will buckle a little bit once it's dries a little more. So we still have time to work, and hopefully we can get our line work in now. So I'm going to just use some round brushes. Maybe I'll use a sword liner brush, so I'll use a couple very small round brushes, sable brushes, for line work. And also I might use a small flat brush, and then I might use a sword liner brush, which is basically a nice, really nice fine line brush for details. And then all we're going to need really for paint is just using our standard palette, and we're just going to use lots of paint and very, very little water, hardly any water whatsoever. Actually just enough water to dampen your brush, and the rest should be fine. So then we're just going to mix the darker blues. So we'll use the French ultramarine blue, burnt umber, a little bit of burnt sienna, and maybe a little bit of alizarin crimson mixed into for some warmer, darker tonal values. But basically this is the formula we want to use. We don't want to really have much water. You can see this doesn't, that paint is not running at all. It's basically just straight paint. And this is what we want to use now to do our line work. So it's essentially we're working from a photograph, or you could also use some sumi ink. I've used sumi ink using this technique. Works really well too. And as you do this technique, you can add a little bit of water to make it a little bit. For certain sections, you might want to have a little bit of, maybe let's say a little bit of more watery consistency occasionally, maybe to do a certain technique or something like that. So, but for the most part, we do want to stick with the very, very dry, just straight out of the tube paint. And then here, this is really essentially the fun part. This is the more you're developing. We already have our pencil drawing, so this is really, the pencil drawing is so valuable because we're just going to use that pencil drawing now to get our line work in. And I'm going to go a little quicker, and you can take your time more. I'll use the sword liner brush, maybe to get a few more finer lines here and there as we go. I'll also use some Payne's Gray. So, and I usually tap a little bit on a tissue to get some drier techniques. So some dry brush technique maybe here. And I think the reason this part is so much fun is when you do that pencil drawing, then you have, like I said, again, you have your template down on where you're going to be doing all your line work with your brushes here and your paint. So it's kind of fun. You can take your time and make interesting tonal value changes with your brush, and so it's more of a really fun, free experience. You know, you really can have a lot of. Again, you can use Sumi ink if you want. You know, so it's kind of for these darker tonal values, Sumi ink would really look good. And these are basically just marks, and we're going to have some different. This is a boat here, so we have a nice. And you can go with a larger brush. You can maybe go with a larger round brush in certain sections here, like this. So your calligraphy, it's up to you what kind of marks you want, what kind of brushes you're going to use. Um, Again, you're using really lots of thick paint. You just keep going back to your palette using your thicker paints, and you just keep using the same colors over and over. You keep mixing your blues and your French ultramarine and your burnt umber, and these are shadow colors under here. So as you can probably see, a lot of the, once we start getting this line work in, it really starts to come together nicely. You get a feel that the picture is starting to take more shape, and there's a lot more interesting things going on. So we'll probably just leave it off as a two-part series here. But we kind of can see how the line work is really starting to. And if you do nice and loose line work and don't get too fussy, and you kind of move at a nice brisk pace, it kind of gets that nice artistic look to it. And again, you can take your time. Again, when you work, you want to make, you kind of want to be careful with like if you're working in certain sections, you want to just try to be careful not to rest your hand into areas you just completed. So it's probably worth it to start on maybe one side and work your way across. I kind of jumped around on this a little bit, but that's probably your best game plan. So if you're working on this picture, you're probably going to want to stick to a game plan of working from one side of the page to the other, so you're not leaning into or making smudges and things. I did make some smudges here. It's not a big deal. And then again, I'm going to use my sword liner brush, and that's where we can get a little more nice, interesting, freer flowing lines. So with the sword liner, get some interesting brush and things like that, some weeds. All right, I think we have the idea. So this is really a fun method to use, the ultra wet technique. Again, if you go back to part one, you'll see how we got the really nice, beautiful, diffused watercolor look with lots of tons of water, paper soaked completely through, and then just set right on top of a masonite, damp masonite board so that the paper stays nice, completely flat. We're on a tiny bit of an angle, maybe a 20% angle on our board. And then once we get our major colors, ideas onto the picture, and we already have of course, the pencil drawing was the first thing we did. And that's really all you need is the base of the pencil drawing. You go in with your colors, and then once that really starts to dry off nice while your paper's still on the board, then you just go in with your almost straight paint, no water, straight out of the tube colors, and you go in and you do your line work to your liking. And you can go loose and fast. You can go a little slower and more cautious and get a little more detail with your line work. It's all up to how you want your painting to eventually look when it's completed. But this is pretty much the idea of doing a nice watercolor wash first, and then going over with some really nice line work, very similar to line and wash technique, but it's a little different with the wetter paper and some of the techniques with the paint, mixing colors for our darks. Okay, hope we had fun, and we'll see you guys on the next video. Bye-bye now.